بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين. أما بعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Inshallah, today we will be discussing the topic of Tajdid and Tafsir. What is meant by Tajdid and Tafsir? Is it really possible for there to be Tajdid and Tafsir? And how do we reconcile this with certain other issues that will come up as we become clear as we move forward? ما المراد بالتجديد في التفسير? What is intended when we speak about تجديد in تفسير؟ المراد ذلك هو العودة بالتفسير إلى انطلاقته الاجتهادية وحريته العلمية المنضبطة بالمنهج الذي كان عليه في زمن الصحابة والتابعين وتابعيهم والأئمة المتبوعين وأئمة التفسير المجتهدين. What is intended by Tajdid and Tafsir is bringing Tafsir back to its origins when it was based on ijtihad. And the Mufassirin had the independence to interpret the Qur'an, to draw meanings from the Qur'an on their own, but regulated by a sound methodology that was followed by the companions and the tabi'een, atba' tabi'een, the Imma, and the Imams of Tafsir who are mujtahid in Tafsir throughout the ages. فالمقصود من الكلام عن التجديد في التفسير هو السعي لتكوين ملكة التفسير ولتخريج مجتهدين في علم التفسير يستطيعون أن يقوموا بالتفسير باجتهادهم المستقل وفق المنهج الإجماعي الذي كان عليه السلف والذي يقوم على أساس التفسير اللغوي الذي يلتزم في تفهمه بمصادر التشريع الكتاب والسنة والإجماع والقياس وبالمنهج الإجماعي للسلف في التعامل مع هذه المصادر. So when we speak about Tajdid and Tafsir, the purpose is to create in people, in students or in scholars, the aptitude to perform tafsir for themselves, the Mلكة, so that we can produce a generation of scholars who are capable of ijtihad and tafsir, capable of performing tafsir based on their own ijtihad and in accordance with the manhaj that the Salaf followed. So it's their and which is agreed upon by ijma'. So there are aspects of the methodology of tafsir which are agreed upon by ijma'. And so this is very important, that the tafsir be done in a method that is in a fashion that is methodologically sound. والذي يقوم على أساس التفسير اللغوي الذي يلتزم في تفهمه بمصادر التشريع الكتاب والسنة والإجماع والقياس وبالمنهج الإجماعي للسلف في التعامل مع هذه المصادر. So basically, ijtihad and tafsir in general, its foundation is التفسير اللغوي الذي يلتزم في تفهمه بمصادر التشريع. And so the basis of tafsir is interpreting the text of the Qur'an according to the dictates of linguistic analysis, according to the dictates of the Arabic language, while keeping in mind the Musadir Tashri'ah. So basically in accordance with the Qur'an and Sunnah. So in interpreting any given text, ensure that it is that your interpretation is consistent with the understanding of the rest of the Qur'an and Sunnah, rather than contradictory with it. And likewise with ijma'. Ijma' is in reality a transmitted form of the sound meaning of the Qur'an and Sunnah. And qiyas is based on a fundamental level understanding the general principles of the Sharia the قواعد of the Sharia and its maqasid, the ta'leel of the ahkam, the underlying rationale that underlies the ahkam, and the legislation. So it must be consistent with all of these things. So if we want to speak about what is known now as usul al-tafsir, and for those of you who are unaware, I have a two lectures on defining tafsir and usul al-tafsir that are available on our channel, that I would recommend for those of you who are interested that you check them out. It's a good introduction to the topic of usul al-tafsir. What is usul al-tafsir? But if we wanted to really sum up the concept of usul al-tafsir in a single statement, it would be this: the foundation of tafsir is the Arabic language. So when you want to interpret the Qur'an, you have a text in front of you, and the foundation of the interpretation would be, what do these words mean in the Arabic language? What do these expressions mean in the Arabic language? How can this text be interpreted in the Arabic language? It's not dependent on a fundamental level on knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah, in that when the Quran was first revealed, it was addressed to an audience. That audience was primarily the Quraysh. The Quraysh, of course, speak the Arabic language. It's their language. It was revealed in their language. But they weren't knowledgeable of the Quran and Sunnah. In fact, they weren't even believers in the Quran and Sunnah. When the Quran was revealed and the Quraysh were hearing these verses of the Quran, they didn't think, oh, let me open up Tafsir ibn Kathir and see what does this verse mean. They would hear it, and by virtue of their knowledge of the language in which it was revealed, to a considerable extent, they would understand it. And so anytime you have a given text, the foundation of understanding it is to understand the language in which that text has been composed. Of course, then there are other things that will come into play in interpretation, but at the root, inevitably, and this is with any text, not just with the Quran, the foundation will be understanding the language. And so understanding the language of the Quran and the sciences of the Arabic language are then going to be essential for understanding the Quran. For us, obviously for our purposes, the study of the Arabic language, unlike for those who the Quran was revealed to, it was simply revealed in their language, and it was a language, they were immersed in the language and using the language, and had a very high command of the language, and so that was enough to guarantee that they have sufficient grasp of the language to understand the Quran. For us today, now we are 1400 years removed from the era of revelation, and languages inevitably evolve. Languages inevitably evolve and change. For us as English speakers, you go back 1400 years, there's no such thing as English language, at least not in any recognizable form. I think if you go back to Anglo-Saxon, you're not going to understand Anglo-Saxon 1,000 years ago, much less 1400 years ago. Even in school, when we study Shakespeare is about 400 years ago, and 400, 500 years ago, and you don't understand everything. Not that it's completely unintelligible, but the text can be a little bit difficult because there might be words or expressions that you're unaccustomed to. But when you go back 1,000 years, then with the English language, it becomes almost unrecognizable. And this is natural in the evolution of languages. But in the Arabic language, we are now 1400 years removed from the time of revelation, from the era of revelation. And so just being a native speaker, even if one was a native speaker of the Arabic language, just by virtue of his being a native speaker of the language would not be enough to qualify him to do tafsir of the Qur'an. Now, being a native speaker of the language, without formal study of the language, he might still be able to understand some of the Qur'an. But given that this gap exists, there'll be certain things that that a person doesn't understand. And so for that reason, formal study of the Arabic language, the sciences that have been developed for the Arabic language, then become necessary to perform this sort of tafsir lughawi that perhaps for the first generations was not necessary, or at least not necessary in the fashion that it is for us. For us, we would have to go through some process of formal study to attain this ability to do tafsir lughawi, linguistic tafsir that was already present in the first generations to receive the Qur'an. So the objective of this book is to develop in the reader, or to lay out a program for the readers to help them develop their mلكة to be able to do tafsir based on ijtihad. And tafsir works in accordance with this method, التفسير اللغوي. And this tafsir based on lugha is then has to be regulated by ensuring that it is in accordance with the rest of the Quran, Sunnah, and the Masadir al-Tashri'. If we wanted to sum up the idea of usul al-tafsir, or the methodology of tafsir, principles of tafsir, if we wanted to sum it up into a single statement, this statement would serve that purpose. This statement could be regarded as a summation of what is the methodology of tafsir. فدعوتنا للتجديد ترفض أن نضيف قيودنا للاجتهاد غير شروطه الصحيحة المعتمدة تحجر واسعه وتضيق آفاقه، كالالتزام بما لا يجب التزامه من تفاسير السلف، فضلا عن الجمود على تفاسير معينة دون غيرها يقتصر عمل أستاذ التفسير فيها ومصنفه على إعادة جهد السابقين باختصار والتطويل دون أي إضافة جديدة تستحق الذكر. So, in calling for and promoting ijtihad in tafsir, first thing Sheikh Hatim says is that we want to place arbitrary conditions that restrict ijtihad. Now, of course, there are legitimate, necessary conditions to perform this sort of ijtihad, but we don't want to put. We want to remove superfluous conditions that don't have a sound basis, or conditions that are not necessary, or not sound. كالالتزام بما لا يجب التزامه من تفاسير السلف. Some might have this notion, and this is a notion that I find some Tulab do in fact have, that it's necessary to stick to certain interpretations that are reported from the Salaf. And this is something that we will discuss a little bit later on. We'll discuss it in a little bit of detail later on. That what is the role of the tafsir of the Salaf, and to what extent is that tafsir binding. Then you have the issue of sticking to certain books of tafsir such that it becomes the role of the professor in the classroom teaching tafsir to simply regurgitate to the students what is written in a particular book or in particular textbooks that are assigned And so each generation of students is simply learning what is in that book. And by the way, this is an important point, that in terms of the way that the Sharia sciences are taught or should be taught, there's a tendency at times that the teacher, the professor, the sheikh uh, will be qualified not so much to teach the science that he's teaching. In this case, it's tafsir, but it could also be usul al-fiqh or any other number of sciences. He's not so much qualified to be teaching tafsir as he is to be teaching that particular book, or to be teaching usul al-fiqh as a science as he is to be teaching this particular manual in usul al-fiqh. And so he will take you through that manual, and he's capable of breaking it down word by word and telling you this is what the author is saying. And so basically what this person has become then is he's a hafiz of this book. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's memorized the book word for word, but essentially he is able to decipher this particular text and pass on to the students that this is what this text is saying. That is not the same as having a mastery of tafsir or having a mastery of usul al-fiqh. And this is something that has become a trend in the recent centuries of Islamic history, that more and more the focus is on the ability to parse and analyze certain texts, and the actual command of the fundamentals of that science tends to weaken and get lost, because the focus has shifted to being able to understand certain texts. And so this in of itself is a problem. And so we find this in the classroom, and as we find this in the classroom, we find its effects also in authorship. In authoring tafsirs, you find that maybe some authors, they really their work revolves around ikhtisar. So maybe they're summarizing, compiling what people have said before them, without much analysis, or unnecessary tatwil. Basically, they're adding something, but they're not adding anything of note. So, for example, someone takes various sources, compiles them together, and then adds a lot of i'rab. Not that, although i'rab can be important in tafsir, but just going through the action of spelling out the i'rab of the verse is not necessarily adding anything to the tafsir, because this is largely going to be based on opinions that already exist. There's different opinions about the i'rab of the verse, and so what previous mufassirin might have mentioned in brief terms, now the person is spelling out the i'rab in full terms. There are certain works dedicated to i'rab of Qur'an. By the way, my intent is not here that these works are not useful. They could be useful, they could be helpful, depending on how easy they are and how accessible they've made the material to the target audience, the level of the reader. But this is not this is not really what is intended here by Tajdid, and this is not ijtihad. And more importantly, it's not a requirement that that contribution to tafsir be limited to this scope. Now, while we're rejecting the idea of arbitrarily restricting ijtihad in tafsir in a fashion that places conditions that are not valid conditions on tafsir, at the same time, we have to be cautious of those who claim ijtihad in tafsir while not not adhering to the proper methodology of tafsir. Either they're not qualified, or they disregard the actual conditions for tafsir to be sound and to be valid, the methodology for tafsir to be sound and valid. كالخروج عن أساليب العربية في الفهم، وعدم الاحتجاج بالسنة مطلقا، وعدم اعتبار الإجماع مطلقا. So you have, for example, some people who, in interpreting the Quran, they disregard a lot of what is dictated by the Arabic language and Arabic usage, or you have some who claim to be interpreting the Quran and reject the Sunnah altogether, and so sometimes you'll find some of them promoting their projects as a project of Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. Of course, Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran is a valuable facet of Tafsir. It's a valuable aspect of Tafsir. It's a valuable tool in the toolkit of the Mufassir to be able to explain the Quran in light of the Quran. And Sheikh Suhaib Saeed has his PhD thesis on this topic, on the methodology of Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. It's a valuable contribution, and I recommend anyone who's interested in understanding Tafsir better that this is something that you need to add to your reading list. But Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran does not mean that you can discount the Sunnah. And then you have Adam i'tibar al-ijma' mutlaqan. Also, this would also be incorrect if someone were to reject the notion of ijma' altogether. If someone were to reject the authority of ijma' altogether. Ijma' it's a difficult topic, but there is a discussion on ijma' and tafsir in this book. It's a brief discussion, but it's a beneficial discussion. Although the topic of ijma', in terms of its theoretical aspects and also in terms of its application, is something that is it's a complicated topic. It's something that merits merits a treatment on its own, but we will be dealing with it briefly in our discussion of this book. As an example of al-khuruj and asalib al-arabiyya fi al-fahm, there are various claims by various individuals to attempt to interpret the Qur'an. And some of these individuals, in claiming to interpret the Qur'an, are following their hawa. And so you find them come out with all sorts of strange interpretations. So, for example, one individual, well, I won't name, has basically more or less claimed that for example, that the aura of a woman is just her private parts, and that basically zina is permissible so long as that it is with mutual consent, and all sorts of strange claims and interpretations. So, for example, the same person, in explaining the verse "Wal Fajr," Allah Subhanahu wa Taala swears by Fajr. Al Fajr is Al Infijar Al Azim. Note that the word that is using infijar is from the same root as Fajr. Al Infijar Al Azim. What is Al Infijar Al Azim? The Big Bang. So, Wal Fajr here refers to the Big Bang. And now, if he had made some sort of linguistic argument showing that the word Fajr could, in fact, somehow be shown to refer to a meaning that is consistent with the idea of the Big Bang, then maybe there would be a leg to stand on. But I think, clearly you can see that with this sort of interpretation, that the word Fajr doesn't mean al-infijar al-azim. Fajr does not mean al-infijar al-azim. It doesn't mean the Big Bang. And so this is an example of someone claiming to do tafsir of the Qur'an, but disregarding the Arabic language in doing so. And so this is also something that is this is unacceptable. Tafsir cannot be done in this fashion. Then in the next section, Sheikh Hatim brings up the question: هل يتقبل التفسير التجديد? Is tajdid something that is possible in tafsir? Does the genre of tafsir accept for the possibility of tajdid? سؤال يجب الجواب عليه قبل الكلام عن أي شيء آخر، لأن أكبر عقبات التجديد في التفسير هي تصور أن مجال التجديد في التفسير مغلق، وأن باب الاجتهاد الحقيقي فيه مسدود منذ جيل السلف. So there is this notion that many people have that the scope for original contribution to tafsir is basically closed, and that the door of true ijtihad in tafsir is closed since the time of the Salaf. ولا يختلف الجواب عن هذا السؤال كثيرا عن الجواب على من أخلد إلى الأرض وجهل أن الاجتهاد في كل أصر فرض، ممن زعم أن باب الاجتهاد في الفقه باب مغلق، وأنه لا يمكن أن يوجد وأنه لا يمكن أن يوجد مجتهد بعد أصر الأئمة. The answer to this question is not much different from the answer to the question to the response to the one who من أخلد إلى الأرض وجهل أن الاجتهاد في كل أصر فرض. This is an allusion to a title by Imam Suyuti, الرد على من أخلد إلى الأرض وجهل أن الاجتهاد في كل أصر فرض. Imam Suyuti, who is the co-author of Tafsir al-Jalalain and other works in Tafsir. He also has a incomplete Hashiyah on Tafsir al-Baydawi, and of course he compiled Durr al-Manthur, which is a collection of Tafsir narrations, as well as al-Itqan fi ulum al-Qur'an and other works related to ulum al-Qur'an and Tafsir sciences. And of course, Imam Suyuti is a prolific author with many works in many fields and sciences and many topics. In his lifetime, there was a controversy that took place between him and his contemporaries about ijtihad, and we don't really want to get into that in detail, but basically it ended up with him claiming that he is in fact a mujtahid mutlaq. Other ulama objected to this, and so this created a lot of discussion and a lot of back and forth about who is a mujtahid and who is not. Is ijtihad possible? Is ijtihad not possible? If it is possible, what kind of ijtihad is possible? And so forth. In that process, he wrote a number of works, the most well-known of them being الرد على من أخلد إلى الأرض وجهل أن الاجتهاد في كل أصر فرض. And basically, Sheikh Hatim is alluding to his title, saying that, just as anyone who claims that that ijtihad in fiqh, that the door is completely closed, is wrong, then the same can be said with regards to tafsir, and the response is not that much different with regards to tafsir. Now, of course, we don't really want to get into the issue of was Suyuti really a mujtahid mutlaq, or was he not a mujtahid mutlaq, and why did he claim that he's a mujtahid mutlaq? And those ulama who criticized him, were they right in doing so? But one thing that should be said is that the idea that ijtihad has come to an end altogether is definitely problematic. And even the taqsimat of the levels of the mujtahids, the different categories that have been drawn up, they're also problematic in some respects. All of that is beyond the scope of our discussion. Sheikh Hatim then goes on to say, ولكن دعونا نجدد في الجواب عن هذا التساؤل. So we could give a lot of the same responses that have been given on this topic with regards to ijtihad and fiqh over the ages, but let's try and do a little bit of tajdid here in regards to answering this question, particularly as it pertains to tafsir. ونخص علم التفسير بما يناسبه من الجواب. يقول أولا خاصية القرآن الكريم نفسه لا تقبل الجمود في التفسير وتنافر عدم التجديد فيه. من ذلك أن القرآن الكريم حمال ذو وجوه. So that basically, first and foremost, the Quran itself, the nature of the Quran, does not accept jumud and tafsir of lack of ijtihad, lack of tajdid, and simply sticking to what is in the books and learning and teaching it by rote learning. That this is something that is inherently contradictory to the nature of the Quran. من ذلك أن القرآن الكريم حمال ذو وجوه. This expression حمال ذو وجوه has come up in a number of narrations from the Salaf, describing the Quran as having many wujuh, having many, carrying many meanings. فقد صح عن عدد من السلف وصف القرآن الكريم بأنه حمال ذو وجوه، وهو ما يثبته الواقع القرآن الكريم نفسه. فما هي طبيعة هذه الوجوه التي يحتملها القرآن الكريم? Incidentally, Sheikh Hatim has added to the book an appendix where he gathers and discusses the narrations on this issue. Who is it reported from that they describe the Quran as in this fashion, as Hammal Dhu Wujuh? So he has some brief discussion and takhrij of these narrations in the appendix. You can check that out. فما هي طبيعة هذه الوجوه التي يحتملها القرآن الكريم? So what is the nature of these multiple meanings that that the text of the Quran carries? من هذه الوجوه الوجه الأول احتمال بعض آياته لاختلاف الأفهام وتعددها دون إنكار على أي فهم منها ودون قطع بخطأ واحد منها، وهو الاحتمال المتحقق في الدلائل الظنية الموجودة في كثير من آيات الكتاب الكريم، بخلاف الدلائل اليقينية فيها والتي لا تقبل تعدد الأفهام ولا تجيز الاختلاف فيها. وقد تبلغ المعاني الظنية المتعددة في درجة قوتها حدا قريبا من التساوي عند المفسر، مما يجعله عاجزا عن الترجيح بينها، ولا يكون لديه فيها راجحا ومرجوح، فيقول ولعل الله تعالى أراد كذا أو أراد كذا. فإن بلغ التقارب بين المعنيين حد التساوي فسوف يقول المفسر حينئذ تحتمل الآية معنيين كلاهما صحيح. So the first point is that some verses are open to different interpretations, without any of those, without it being possible to say that any one of those interpretations is certainly wrong. And so this is the case where you have certain aspects of verses will have the dalala will be dhanniya, meaning the meaning that can be taken from it. Given meanings will be dhanniya, they're not certain. They don't rise to the level of being yaqini. And this is these mustalahat, dhann and qata or dhann and yaqeen, are used a lot in the Islamic sciences. So you should probably be familiar with them. But for those who are new, just briefly, basically, qat' or yaqeen means something that is certain. And so a text that has that is yaqini in its dilala means that this meaning is definitely the meaning of the text, or is definitely found in this text, and it's not open for debate. This is something that is certain. But when you have dilala that is dhanniya, the dilala that is dhanniya is, it could mean this or it could mean that. And one of those dalalat might be stronger. One of those dalalat might be stronger. But it could mean this and it could also mean this. And so this is what we would call دلالة ظنية. وقد تبلغ المعاني الظنية المتعددة في درجة قوتها حدا قريبا من التساوي عند المفسر. Now, when these differing meanings that we're characterizing as dhanni, if they're very close to one another in terms of their relative strength, it might make it difficult or impossible for the Mufassir to choose one over the other, or to prefer one over the other, in which case he might say, وَلَعَلَّ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى أَرَادَ كَذَا وَأَرَادَ كَذَا. Might very well say it's possible that Allah intended this or intended this. فإن بلغ التقارب بين المعنيين حد التساوي. So if it reaches the point of being almost equal or equal, at that point, the Mufassir might even say that both meanings, that this verse could mean this and it could mean, it has both these meanings, and both are correct. Both are correct meanings. And this leads us to الوجه الثاني. احتمال التركيب في عبارة الآية لأكثر من تفسير صحيح وقد يستويان في المرجحات، فيجب حمل الآية عليهما كليهما، كاختلاف معنى الآية باختلاف الوقف فيها، كاختلاف المعنى في الوقف عند لفظ الجلالة إلا الله، وعند لفظ العلم في قوله تعالى وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. So an example of this is when, okay, so basically here Sheikh Hatim is talking about when the tarkib, the sentence structure, is open to more than one interpretation, and they're equal in terms of the evidence or the arguments that can be offered, murajjihat, present for this qawl are equal to the ones present for this qawl. In this case, يجب حمل الآية عليهما كليهما. In that case, it would be necessary to understand the verse in both fashions. An example that he gives to illustrate this is where you have the meaning of the verse changes based on the waqf. Now, basically, the idea of waqf in the ayat is that the Qur'an was written without any sort of, we would call punctuation marks. So where is the sentence ending, where is the sentence beginning, sometimes depends on how you read the verse. And an example of this is in verse number 7 of Surah Ali Imran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِندِ رَبِّنَا. You can stop here. In reading this, you could read وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ, full stop. None knows its interpretation except for Allah. وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِندِ رَبِّنَا. And those who are firmly grounded in knowledge say, we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord. This gives a certain meaning. It's also read it's also read with the stop at الراسخون في العلم. So then it becomes وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم, full stop. None knows its interpretation except for Allah and those firmly grounded in knowledge. So note that with the first reading, we're saying none knows its interpretation except for Allah. Now we're saying none knows its interpretation except for Allah and الراسخون في العلم. يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. And so then يقولون becomes the beginning of the next sentence. يقولون then is the beginning of the next sentence. They say, we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord. With the first reading, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ, none knows its interpretation except for Allah. What would be the fa'idah of them saying, آمَنَّا بِهِ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ رَبِّنَا? It would be that those who are firmly grounded in knowledge don't reject that which they don't know the interpretation of. They would say, we believe in it because all of it is from our Lord. With the second reading, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ, none knows its interpretation except for Allah and except for the firmly grounded scholars. When they say we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord, the implication of this statement then would become that we believe in it, all of it is from our Lord, and so we reconcile all the verses together. We understand the mutashabih and the muhkam together as a cohesive whole, because all of it is from our Lord, so we can't attribute conflicting meanings and then claim that oh, this means this and this means that, such that basically, you know, they're throwing the mutashabih verses against the muhkam verses. And just to illustrate, in the sub, this is actually a lengthy verse. It begins, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله. Allah is, He is the one who sent down to the book. It has certain verses that are muhkamat. These ayat muhkamat are the verses that are clear and indisputable, and they're the foundation of the book. And there are other verses that are ambiguous. As for those who have some twistedness in their heart, they have ill intent, they seek out these ambiguous, they seek out these ambiguities in these certain verses to create discord and to interpret them in the fashion that suits their agendas. And so, in terms of the sabab al-nuzul of this verse, the reason why this verse was revealed, there are some reports that this was revealed about a group of Christians who came to the Prophet ﷺ, and they tried to claim that the Qur'an in fact justifies their belief about Isa alayhi salam and about the Trinity. So, for example, Allah in various places refers to Himself using the plural, nahnu, inna, etc. And so they say, see, Allah is using the plural as Trinity. So, or Allah calls Isa alayhi salam kalimatun minhu wa ruhan minhu, and so this indicates, we are saying that He is basically the Logos, He is the divine word, and so He's divine, and so forth. So they caught on to certain ambiguous statements in the Quran about Isa or about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to say that oh, this is what the Quran is saying, even though this is very clearly false. Anyone who reads the Quran can see very clearly that this is not what the Quran is saying. These verses, if you were to take them in isolation and disregard everything else, sure, you might say that, well, maybe it could mean this could be a possible meaning. But when looked at in terms of as a whole, text as a whole, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Clearly, he doesn't. So clearly, these other verses are not intended to be reference to the Trinity or to the divinity of Isa alayhi salam. Allah explicitly in Surah Al-Ikhlas and in many other places insists that he is one. He explicitly describes the belief that Isa alayhi salam is his son as kufr. He explicitly in numerous verses condemns those who attribute any sort of offspring to Allah. He explicitly condemns as disbelievers those who say that the Christians who say that Inna Allah thalithu thalatha, that Allah is part of a trinity. So the verses of the Qur'an on this are explicit, and so these verses that have some degree of ambiguity can only be understood in this fashion when you disregard the other verses. And so this is based on the reading where we have the rasikhun fil ilm, or amongst those who know the ta'wil of the mutashabih, then what is intended is آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. We believe in the whole of the Quran because all of it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of it is from our Lord, and so we know that it can't be contradicting, and we know that all of it has to be understood in a coherent fashion. And so these ambiguous verses, the mutashabihat, have to be understood in light of muhkamat. Whereas if you say وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ, none knows its interpretation except for Allah. Or ta'wil can also mean its reality. None knows its reality except for Allah. Because the word ta'wil can mean the interpretation, or tafsir, and also mean the haqiqah, the reality of something. None knows its reality except for Allah. In this case, then it refers to mutashabihat in the sense of things that are matters of ghaib. For example, so only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge of them, such as when is in fact the hour going to come to pass, when is the resurrection going to happen, other things that have been mentioned in the Quran that are matters of ghaib. The true reality of them is known only to Allah. So here, even the rasikhuna fil ilm do not know the reality of these things, but they believe in it. They believe in what they're capable of knowing and grasping, and that which is beyond their knowledge and their grasp. And this is part of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you see how in with this verse, these two different readings, these two different ways of reading the verse, depending on where you're placing the waqf, where you're making the stop, change the sentence and change the meaning. But both meanings, both readings give a valid meaning. Both of them give a valid meaning. واختلاف الدلالة, and so another example Sheikh Hatim gives, ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين. You'll note that this verse has the two sets of three dots, which are intended to indicate that you can stop either in the first place or in the second place. Choose one or the other, but you don't stop in both. You can read ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين, or you can read ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين. And so it becomes, now here the difference is perhaps much more negligible, not nearly as significant as the previous example. But basically you have, this is the book, no doubt, it contains guidance for the muttaqeen. This is the book in which there is no doubt a guidance for the muttaqeen. So the sentence structure changes a little bit, and that could possibly change some of the implications or connotations of the verse slightly based on these two different readings. And in the Musahif that most of us read, that are according to the Qira'ah of Hafs, you will find that you have these two options have been given for waqf. Although the Musahif that are written according to the Qira'ah of Nafi', I believe Nafi' prefers to stop at La Rayb. And so in those Musahif, they don't give these two different options for waqf. Coming back here, you'll note that there's a symbol for waqf here, and وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ, but they didn't put one on وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ, and they didn't use the three dots here and here. That is also an interesting point related to ijtihad and tafsir, that where to put wuquf, where to put alamat of waqf, is in of itself a matter of ijtihad. And so some ulama actually prefer that the waqf be on وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ. They prefer this. And so the alama of the marking for the stop at the waqf has been placed here in our Musahif in accordance with this view of a group of ulama. Otherwise, you have other ulama, like for example Imam Ibn Atiyah in his Tafsir has a very lengthy discussion on this verse, and he favors the view that both readings are not only correct, but although there's difference between the readings, that ultimately the meanings that can be taken from the verse are not radically different according to either reading. And so his interpretation would suggest that both of these stops should be seen as equally acceptable. Again, that's according to his ijtihad. And when these alamat of waqf are placed in the Musahif, they're based on certain ulama's ijtihad. Of course, there might be many of them that are not really anything that is going to be a difference of interpretation amongst the ulama. But in a number of places, you'll find that the alamat of waqf, as they are placed, are a result of following the ijtihad of one group of scholars, but the ijtihad of another group of scholars would be different. And so in reading tafsir and looking at the books that deal specifically with the wuquf of the Qur'an, as there's dedicated literature for that as well, you could explore why has Nafi', for example, preferred the stop on La Rayb over stop on La Rayba Fi. And you'll find, looking in the books of tafsir, you'll find some mufassirin favor the stop on La Rayba Fi. And so you would want, that is something that is for the student of tafsir, the scholar of tafsir, worth exploring. Are the these two stops, are they genuinely equal? Is one of them preferable? And again, here when we're speaking about preferable, would just be in terms of which one actually gives the stronger meaning, which one gives a better meaning. And if neither gives a better meaning, then you could say, as we have here, and as is the waqf in our Musahif, that these two readings are basically equal, without there being a rajih and a marjuh, without there being one reading more preferable than the other. But here you'll note that with this example, Shaykh Hatim is actually suggesting that these two readings are equal. As he said, قَدْ يَسْتَوِيَانِ فِي الْمُرَجِّحَاتِ. So here for Shaykh Hatim, these readings might very well be equal, and they might very well be equal in terms of the murajjihat, but the alama of waqf that has been placed here, and this is following the rasm that is in our Musahif. The llama of waqt that has been placed here is actually in accordance with the view that the the waqf on illallah is preferable over warasikhuna fil ilm. And again, that would be something that is worth your while to investigate in the books of tafsir and the various uh, works dealing with wukuf as well, to try and understand why do some ulama prefer this stop. What are possible arguments for preferring the stop on warasikhuna fil ilm? Can we say that these two readings are in fact equal? So that is another example of the Quran being Hammal Dhu Wujuh. الوجه الثالث المشترك اللفظي إذا لم يرجح السياق إرادة أحدهما على الآخر. So you have certain verbs that are what is known as mushtarak, المشترك اللفظي, or homonyms, words that the same word has more than one meaning. وقوله تعالى والليل إذا عسعس فعسعس من الأضداد، والأضداد سورة من سور المشترك، وهي تأتي بمعنى أقبل وبمعنى أدبر. So it can mean to come and it can mean to go. والآية ليس فيها ما يرجح أحد المعنيين على الآخر، فقد يكون الله تعالى قد أقسم بالليل إذا أقبل وقد يكون أقسم بالليل إذا أدبر. So والليل إذا عسعس could mean by the Allah swearing by the night as it comes, as it approaches, or it could mean that he's swearing by the night as it passes. وقد يكون أراد القسم بكليهما معا, and it's possible that maybe he intended both, and that's why this particular expression was chosen instead of وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا أَقْبَلَ or وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا أَدْبَرَ, because this allows the possibility of giving both meanings. وَمَا عَدَمِ وُجُودِ الْمُرَجِّحِ, supposing that there's not some sort of evidence that makes one of these interpretations stronger, we would say إن الله تعالى قد أقسم بالليل في حالتي الإقبال والإدبار معا, that Allah is swearing by the night in both of these states, when it's coming and as it's departing. الوجه الرابع القراءات ذات المعاني المختلفة. We have in certain verses multiple readings, multiple قراءات that give different meanings. حتى لقد قرر العلماء قاعدة شهيرة تبين عظيم أثر القراءات في تعدد المعاني، حيث قالوا إن القراءتين إذا ظهر تعارضهما في آية واحدة كان لهما حكم الآيتين، والثلاثة كثلاث آيات، وهكذا بشرط اختلاف المعنى بينها. وقد لا يختلف المعنى، لكن كل قراءة تضيف معنى بلاغيا وتؤكد على معنى لا تؤكد عليه الأخرى. Okay, so you have with قراءات, sometimes the difference in قراءات changes the meaning, and sometimes the difference in قراءات gives the same general meaning, but maybe one reading emphasizes a particular meaning that the other reading doesn't emphasize, or it adds an additional subtle connotation that can be taken from applying the tools of ilm al-balagha that the other reading doesn't. ومن أمثلة ذلك اختلاف القراءة في فتح الراء وكسرها في مفرطون، من قوله تعالى لا جرم أن لهم النار وأنهم مفرطون بالفتح، وهي قراءة الجمهور بمعنى منسيون متروكون أو مقدمون سابقون إلى النار، وبالفتح وهي قراءة نافع تكون اسم فاعل من أفرط. So this would be reading it لا جرم أن لهم النار وأنهم مفرطون، فيكون المعنى حقا أن لهم النار وأنهم مسرفون في الإسيان، وتكون كقوله تعالى وأن المسرفين هم أصحاب النار. Give me a second. So looking at the different translations of this verse, let's see if I don't know if you guys can see this, but so most of the interpretations, they will be abandoned, they will be left out. When this is for وأنهم مفرطون. This is how most of them are interpreting it. Neglected. But then there is an interpretation or a translation here. For they have rebelled. No doubt they will have the fire, for they have rebelled. So this is looking at, this is an actual translation that has translated the verse according to the reading of mufritun instead of mufratun. Okay, so note this translation from Aisha Bewley, because Aisha Bewley in her translation of the Quran was actually attempting to stick to the qira'ah of Nafi. She's attempting to stick to the qira'ah of Nafi. And there are people who go to excess. So that's different from being abandoned. Now this other translation here, they didn't. I don't know if what is their methodology in terms of sticking to a particular qira'ah. This is also an interesting issue that comes up with regards. There are persons who have crossed the limit, because you note that this translation, even though I doubt, obviously this is not a translation by Ahmed Raza Khan himself, it's probably a translation of his translation, but I doubt that that the translators have made it clear that they are using a different qira'ah. They're not actually translating it according to the translation of, according to the qira'ah of Hafs here. But you see here that the majority of translations are based on this reading, mufratun. Majority are based on reading it as mufratun. And then you have a few that are reading it based on mufratun. Now for Aisha Bewley's, that makes sense because her translation is explicitly according to, intended to be according to the recitation of Nafi. So that is for her, that is by design. That should be the case. But this is something that you will note when reading translations, is that while the translations generally stick to Hafs, sometimes you'll find some narrators actually depart from the qira'ah of Hafs and Asim to a different qira'ah, and they will translate the verse in accordance with a different qira'ah, not the qira'ah of Hafs. And in some cases, it might very well be possible that some of them are doing this because they're looking at what Mufassirin have said, not realizing that the interpretation being given by this particular Mufassir is based on this qira'ah rather than the other qira'ah. And this is an important point to be aware of as well when you're reading tafsir, that sometimes when you find different interpretations, you need to be aware that these different interpreters might very well have been looking, might very well have had a particular qira'ah in mind when they interpreted that verse. وكالاختلاف في تفسير قوله تعالى هو الذي يرسل الرياح بشرا بين يدي رحمته وهل هي بشرا أم نشرا. وقد صنف في بيان أثرها في التفسير عدد من المصنفات. So there's a dedicated genre on dealing with qira'at and the interpretation of or the ramifications of the different qira'at. Sheikh Hatim mentioned this principle that many ulama have mentioned, that القراءتان لها حكم الآيتين. So or لكل قراءة حكم آية مستقلة. This is actually it's a little bit of a complicated discussion, and I won't get into it, but it is reflective of one of various approaches that the ulama, that Mufassirin took to dealing with issues of different qira'at. This is something that if you dig deeper into the books of Tafsir, you'll find that there's oftentimes different approaches to dealing with how to reconcile different qira'at, or what is the ramification of a verse having multiple qira'at and its possible interpretations. Again, that perhaps merits its own discussion at some other point in time. الوجه الخامس أفراد العمومات الذين يشملهم اللفظ العام وقد يغيب عن الذهن شمول اللفظ العام لبعض أفراده في زمن من الأزمان وعند بعض المفسرين، وتحضر تلك الأفراد في زمن آخر، يتضح عند المفسرين شمول العموم لها، وذلك قوله تعالى: والخيل والبغال والحمير لتركبوها وزينة ويخلق ما لا تعلمون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse is reminding us of this blessing of these different pack animals that He has given us, لتركبوها وزينة, for us to ride on, and also as a sort of adornment. ويخلق ما لا تعلمون, and He creates or shall create that which you have no knowledge of. وقوله تعالى ويخلق ما لا تعلمون أتاح فيه عموم اسم الموصول ما استحضار وسائل التنقل الحديثة من سيارات وطائرات وقطارات. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, when He says وَيَخْلُقُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, He creates that which you do not know, meaning for our purpose to use for writing. This usage of ma, which is am, it's a general expression. It allows the possibility of including the modern means of transport as part of the interpretation of this verse. في سياق تذكير الله تعالى لنا بإنعامه علينا بنعمة المركوبات، مع أن هذه المركوبات الحديثة لم تكن تخطر ببال السلف. So the Salaf could not have possibly had any of these things in mind when interpreting the verse. But today, as Sheikh Hatim says, هي اليوم أكثر حضورا في شعور الناس وأوضح في الامتنان بها من تلك المركوبات المعينة بالاسم من وسائل التنقل القديمة. It says that, but for most people today, these things are more pertinent when it comes to the blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us of these means of transport. These are more pertinent to most people today than horses and mules and donkeys, because for the most part, most of us today maybe we've never even seen a horse or mule or donkey, much less riding on them and using them as transport. ووازن الآن بين فهمنا نحن لهذه الآية وفهم السلف لها لتعلموا الأثر الواضح والفرق الكبير بين فهم السلف لذلك العموم وفهمنا نحن له، مما لم ينتج عن قصور فهم السلف، لكنه نتج عن عظمة كلام الله وعن تعدد وجوه فهمه بسبب العمومات التي قد يعجز العقل عن حصر كل أفرادها حين يكون لذلك الحصر أثر في فهم المراد من كلام الله. He says, compared, how we would understand this verse today and how the Salaf would understand it, and you will realize the clear difference between how the Salaf would have understood the umum, the generality that is present in this expression, and how we would understand it. It's not due to any lack on their part. It's not due to any shortcoming on their part in terms of their understanding of the Quran, but this is, a sign of the greatness of Allah's speech, and it's the multiple meanings or layers of meaning that can be found in the Quran as a result of these general expressions, which could encompass many different meanings, which in some case, the aql, the human intellect, might be incapable of grasping all of them. And here we see that that this hasr, this ability to identify all of what falls under the general meaning of the verse, has an effect on how we understand that verse. الوجه السادس الآيات التي تتضمن أصولا كلية وقواعد فقهية وأسسا فكرية ومعرفية وقضائية عدلية تحتكم العقول إليها في الوقائع المتجددة وفي الصور الكثيرة جدا التي لا تكاد تتناهى، خاصة عندما تكون تلك الآيات هي النص الوحيد من نصوص الوحي كتابا وسنة الذي يبين هداية الله تعالى في بعض الوقائع والصور، فتأتي كلية تلك الآيات لتتيح استخراج أحكام شرعية ولتوفق المستنبطين إلى استلحام هدايات ربانية لا تكاد تنحصر. Many verses give us general principles, they give us legal maxims, they give us foundations for our ideas, our thoughts, for legal matters that we can continue to refer to draw guidance from and to draw ahkam from. And this is particularly true when that particular verse might very well be the one text in the Quran and Sunnah that deals with guidance for this particular new issue that might have arisen, or this new situation that might have arisen. And so these verses being sort of kulliya, being universal or being general principles, allow us to extract from them rulings, legal rulings, as well as guidance for different types of situations that might not strictly be a matter of sort of a legal issue. ومن أمثال هذه الآيات الكلية قوله تعالى لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not burden a soul with more than it can bear. لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. No bearer of burdens shall bear the burden of another. وقوله تعالى وما جعل عليكم في الدين من حرج. Allah does not place undue hardship on you in any matter of religion. ولا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not consume one another's wealth by false means. قولوا للناس حسنا. Speak good words to mankind or to people. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي. Allah commands justice. Ihsan could be doing good to others, being generous to others. إيتاء ذي القربى, and giving the relatives their rights, or being generous to relatives. وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي, and he prohibits lewdness, wickedness. He prohibits al-munkar, evil, baghi, transgressing against others. قل إن الله لا يأمر بالفحشاء. Allah does not command lewdness or wickedness. فهذه كلها أصول كلية وقواعد عامة تتيح الاجتهاد في تنزيلها على الوقائع التي لا تكاد تنتهي إلا بنهاية الدنيا. And so they have the existence of these universal principles or general principles allows for continued ijtihad in applying them to issues that will arise and that will continue to arise and will not come to an end except with the end of the world. And this certainly makes sense given that the Qur'an is intended to be the final revelation. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, his message is the final message for mankind. And so therefore, it's necessary that the guidance that he provides be comprehensive for the needs of the ummah until the end of the world. And so this is manifested in the existence of these general principles that can provide us guidance, and from which we should take guidance for the issues that face us. And this doesn't have to do just with strictly individual legal issues that might arise that need a fatwa. I mean, now in the modern era, in today's day, we have all sorts of questions that are coming up that people are raising on all manner of issues to do with the family system, the structure of society, the relationship between husband and wife, the role of man in society, the role of woman in society. There's a lot of issues that are arising, a lot of issues that are being raised. Some of them due to perhaps the influence of ever-changing Western civilization and its standards, spread of their ideologies, no doubt has having an impact on some of these issues. But then some of them also are simply a function of significant changes that have taken place in modern society. And so these raise, perhaps challenging questions which need answers, and the answers to these questions, no doubt, do lie not partly, of course, in understanding the reality of these issues, having an in-depth understanding of the challenges in terms of the reality of them, the nature of them, the factors that influence them on the ground. But ultimately, there is no doubt that guidance for all of these matters lies in the Quran and Sunnah. And so the one who understands the issues that have arisen and is able to take them back to the Quran and Sunnah will be able to find the guidance for them in the Quran and Sunnah. Al-Wajh al-Sabi'. So now, note with all of these previous things, we talked about multiplicity of meaning in the in the verses of the Quran. All of these previous wujuh were basically things that are positive. Al-Wajh al-Sabi' is al-mutashabih alladhi yuhmal ala al-muhkam. Where you have mutashabihat, ambiguous verses that have, or ambiguous passages in the Quran that have been understood in light of the clear ones. And so these verses that are ambiguous are also Hammal Dhu Wujuh. And this is why those who, as we mentioned, الذين في قلوبهم مرض, those who have zayg in their hearts, those who have some twistedness in their hearts, they have their own agendas, they will interpret these verses in the fashion that accords with their hawa, even though the only correct interpretation is to interpret them in a fashion that is consistent with the rest of the Quran, with the muhkamat of the Quran. And so with this discussion of these 7 wujuh of different of multiplicity in meaning that is found in the verses of the Quran, you can see how the Quran is open to different it's open to exploring and discovering new meanings. except of course in this last one, number 7. This is something that is to be condemned. لا يتوسع به إلا الذين في قلوبهم زيغ. So no one will try and seek new meanings in this fashion, except if they have ill will, ill intent. And so such people will, rather than referring the mutashabih, ambiguous verses, to the clear verses, will twist the ambiguous, they will twist the clear verses to match their own twisted understanding of the ambiguous verses. Sheikh Hatim then goes on to make a point: وما كثرة وجوه معاني القرآن الكريم على ما سبق بيانه إلا أن ذلك لا يبيح التجرؤ على معانيه بغير علم. The fact that there are many, that the Quran is open to many, the text of the Quran has many layers of meaning or multiple meanings that can be taken from it. إلا أن ذلك لا يبيح التجرؤ على معانيه بغير علم. That doesn't mean that anyone can speak about the interpretation of the Quran without knowledge, without qualifications. فهي وجوه توسع للعالم التقي وحده. That this is only for the person who is an alim, a God-fearing scholar. وتوجب عدم التناهي هداية كتاب الله. But they also imply that the guidance of Allah's book does not end. And they affirm the description of Allah's book. There's a famous narration from Ali describing the Quran as saying its wonders never cease, or as Shaykh Hatim basically paraphrased it here: its wonders never cease, its wisdom never is exhausted, it never grows old, no matter how much you read it repeatedly. ولكنها على غير العالم التقي توجب التوقف والتخوف وعدم الكلام بغير علم. But the fact that they're open to these multiple layers of meaning, while the alim is able to draw these things out from it. As for the one who is not an alim, the one who is not a God-fearing alim, they necessitate that he should be cautious and beware of speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without knowledge, and speaking about his book without knowledge. Then finally Shaykh Hatim says: من اللطائف أن أحد أقوى طرق أثر القرآن ذو وجوه فهو ما صح عن أبي قلابة عبد الله بن زيد الجرمي أنه رواه مرسلا عن أبي الدرداء رضي الله عنه أنه قال: إنك لن تفقه كل الفقه حتى ترى للقرآن وجوها. فسأل حماد بن زيد شيخه أيوب السختياني عن معناه قائلا: قلت لأيوب: أرأيت قوله حتى ترى للقرآن وجوها؟ فأسكت يتفكر. قال حماد: فقلت: هو أن يرى له وجوها فيهاب الإقدام عليه؟ قال: هو هذا وهذا. So Shaykh Hatim says that one of the strongest narrations concerning this is what is authentic, basically has an authentic chain from Abu Qilaba, that he reports mursalan from Abu-Darda. So there's a break in the chain between Abu Qilaba and Abu-Darda. But Abu-Darda said, reportedly, إنك لن تفقه كل الفقه حتى ترى للقرآن وجوها. You will not attain full fiqh, full understanding, deep understanding, until you recognize wujuh in the Quran, multiple meanings. Hamad ibn Zayd, who is one of the narrators, he asked Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani, his teacher, who's narrating, took this narration from him, what does this mean? So Ayyub stopped and started reflecting what it could mean. And Hamad said to him, perhaps does it mean that he recognizes in it multiple meanings, and so he is weary of interpreting it. And so Ayub says, هو هذا. Yes, this is what it means. This is what it means. والحقيقة أن هذه الهيبة من تفسير كتاب الله العزيز إن كانت هي إحدى ما تفيده حقيقة كون القرآن الكريم ذا وجوه متعددة من المعاني، فليست هي أظهر إفاداتها خاصة لأهل العلم، خلافا لما يوهي به جواب أيوب السختياني. So this is one important point that we can take from recognizing that the Quran is open to multiple meanings, that the text of the Quran is open to multiple meanings. But this is not the most important benefit that can be taken from this point, particularly for the knowledgeable, for the scholars. Unlike what the words of Ayub and Hamad here seem to imply. بل المعنى الأظهر لعبارة إنك لن تفقه كل الفقه حتى ترى للقرآن وجوها هي أنك لن تفقه الفقه الحقيقي حتى تدرك سعة ما يحتمله النص القرآني من المعاني وأن تستخرج ما تقدر عليه من كنوزه المطبوعة، وبذلك فقط سوف تفقه كل الفقه حسب التعبير الآخر. The more apparent interpretation of this statement attributed to Abul-Darda is that you will not attain true fiqh, full fiqh, until you grasp the vastness of the meanings that can be drawn from the Quranic text, and until you are able, extract from it all that you are able of its hidden gems, its hidden meanings, and only then can you have said to attain كل الفقه, complete understanding. And fiqh in the Arabic language basically means deep understanding, not just surface level understanding. أما لو كان عامة شأن المتفقه أن يهاب تفسير القرآن وأن يتحير في فهم مراد الله بسبب تعدد معانيه وغزارة مراميه، فكيف إذن سيفقهه بعض الفقه لا كل الفقه? Because if a person who is, studying the religion, who's a طالب علم, if all the time he is weary of interpreting the Quran and is bewildered by its meanings, because of the richness of its meanings and its implications, and so he's weary of engaging in tafsir of the Quran and he avoids it, how can this person be said to have attained بعض الفقه, some fiqh, much less كل الفقه؟ وبذلك يتبين أن تفسير أيوب لكلمة أبي الدرداء اقتصر فيه على أحد معانيها ولم يذكر أهم معانيها وأظهر مراد يقتضيه لفظها ويقتضيه معناها من قول الفقه لا يتحقق بالتحير والتردد والتوقف، ويقتضيه الجمع بين وصفين ثابتين للقرآن الكريم، وصفه بتعدد المعاني وأنه حمال ذو وجوه، ووصفه الأظهر وخاصيته الأشهر من كونه مبينا واضحا. So he says that from this we can see clearly that Ayyub's interpretation of this expression of Abul-Darda only gives one of its meanings, and in reality he missed the most important meaning and the most apparent meaning, which is dictated by the fact that fiqh cannot be attained by being confused and doubtful, and also this is dictated by the fact that the Quran has been described as having multiple meanings. This is true. It is Hammal Dhu Wujuh, and more importantly, it's mubin. It's واضح. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تلك آيات الكتاب والقرآن المبين وقد أنزلنا إليكم آيات مبينات بلسان عربي مبين ولقد يسرنا القرآن للذكر فهل من مدكر. So we have all of these verses that tell us the Quran is clear, as well as verses that tell us that the Quran has multiple meanings or multiple layers of meaning. And so the only way to reconcile the fact that it has multiple layers of meaning with the fact that it's clear would be that it has meanings that are clear, then it has additional meanings and additional lessons that can be drawn from it, and that this is not something to be afraid of, at least for the person who is qualified. وإننا لكما نخشى من تجرؤ الجحال والذين في قلوبهم مرض على كتاب الله، فإننا نخشى من جمود العلماء وأهل التقوى، ومن تشريع الجمود والتقليد بحجة هيبة القرآن الكريم. Just as we are afraid that ignorant people and people with ill will, ill intent will speak about the Quran and twist the Quran and misinterpret the Quran, likewise we should be afraid of people of knowledge and taqwa being afraid to engage in tafsir, with the justification that that we should be, have haiba, respect for the Quran, be weary of speaking without knowledge about the Quran, because this encourages stagnation, intellectual stagnation, and taqlid. وَلَجَمُودُ أَهْلِ الْقُرْآنِ أَخْطَرُ عَلَى الْقُرْآنِ مِنْ تَطَاوُلِ الْجُهَلَاءِ. And this stagnation from the people of the Quran is more dangerous than these ignorant people speaking without knowledge, because it is this stagnation that opens the door for chaos with the claim of ijtihad. People claiming ijtihad for themselves, engaging in ijtihad for themselves, because if there were sufficient ulama in the ummah fulfilling this role, then it would be very difficult for these ignorant people to find basically a marketplace for their nonsense, and they would not have the same opportunity to spread their ignorance that results in distorting the meanings of Allah's words in the name of not doing taqlid. And finally, Shaykh Hatim says that وأخيرا ما هاب القرآن من لم يأتمر بأمره ومن لم يعمل بموجب إنزاله وبالهدف من إكرامنا به بتدبره والتعمق في فهمه وفي اقتباس أنواره الظاهرة والخفية. قال تعالى كتاب أنزلناه إليك مبارك ليدبروا آياته وليتذكر أولو الألباب. So how can you say that you're respecting the Quran if you're not fulfilling its command, and you're not fulfilling the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it to us? To ponder it, to dig deep into its meanings, to try and understand it deeply, to try and extract its guidance. Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarakun. It's a book that we sent down to you that is blessed. Why? So that they would ponder its verses, and so that the people of intellect would take heed. Inshallah, in our next session, we'll be discussing from here, بين التجديد في التفسير والالتزام بتفسير السلف, looking at what is the role of the tafsir of the salaf, what the authority of the tafsir of the salaf. Conclude with that. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.